John Barrymore annihilated his wife in a Manhattan courtroom in 1928. He did not need to be present. He sent attorneys. He was on a film set in California, earning more money than Blanche Oelrichs would see in the rest of her life. The papers were filed, the arguments made, the judgment rendered. Primary custody of their daughter Diana, 7 years old, awarded to the father. Blanche Oelrichs lost her daughter that morning. She also lost, though the paperwork did not itemize this, her last claim to the future she had imagined when she chose at enormous cost to stop being John Barrymore's wife. She had been a poet. She had been Michael Strange, the pen name she wore like armor, the literary identity she had built before she ever let him into her life. She had been an Oelrichs of Newport, Rhode Island, which is a specific and formidable thing to be. She had been, in every accounting, a woman of substance. By 1928, she was 42 years old, and she was sitting on a wooden bench in a courthouse with both hands in her lap, and she was looking at the floor, and the man who had done this was not even in the same city. This is not a story about a difficult marriage. This is a story about a system, legal, social, financial, familial, that was constructed to protect men like John Barrymore from the consequences of what they do to women like Blanche Oelrichs, and about what happens to a woman when that system works exactly as designed. Old money counts on your silence. Subscribe before they bury this. Like so it spreads. The custody filing was not an act of passion. Passion you can survive. Passion burns fast, makes mistakes, leaves evidence of itself. What John Barrymore deployed against Blanche Oelrichs in the New York courts between 1925 and 1928 was something colder and more durable. Strategy. His legal team, assembled with the funds of a man who had been Hollywood's highest-paid actor for the better part of 6 years, constructed a case with the methodical patience of people who have won cases like this before, because they had. The mechanism was the characterization of the mother as unfit. This is the oldest move in the custody litigation playbook, and it is deployed with particular effectiveness against women who have committed the specific offense of wanting to be known for something other than their husband. Blanche Oelrichs had published 2 volumes of poetry under the name Michael Strange. She had written and produced a play on Broadway. She had given public readings, had been quoted in newspapers, had cultivated a literary identity that existed independently of her marriage to the most famous actor in America. Barrymore's attorneys introduced all of this as evidence of neglect. Read that again. Her published poetry was introduced as evidence of maternal neglect. The argument was not made crudely. It was not stated plainly that a woman who writes is a bad mother. It was structured more carefully than that. The literary pursuits required absences, required focus that should have been directed toward the child, required the company of people whose influence on a household was presented with delicate implication as unsuitable. The pen name Michael Strange was itself weaponized. Here is a woman, the argument implied, who has constructed an alternate identity, who is perhaps not quite stable in her sense of self, who is not entirely what she presents. Who can say what such a woman is when no one is watching? They used her nervous breakdowns. In 1922 and again in 1924, Blanche had been treated for what physicians called nervous exhaustion, the catch-all diagnostic category that the era applied to women whose bodies refused to perform ongoing exposure-tolerable circumstances. The 1924 treatment involved a residence of several weeks at a sanitarium in Westchester County. Barrymore's attorneys introduced the medical records into the custody proceedings. They did not note, because they were not required to note, that the nervous exhaustions were temporarily correlated with periods of acute marital violence. They presented them as free-floating evidence of a constitutional instability that predated the marriage and would outlast it. Barrymore himself gave testimony. This is the detail that most deserves slow examination. He appeared, not in person, in deposition, and he expressed concern, regret, The language of a man who has been wounded by the failure of a marriage he had tried very hard to make work. He described Blanche with something approaching sorrow. A talented woman, a real artist, but troubled in ways that were not her fault and could not be helped. He was worried about Diana. He had Diana's welfare at the center of his thinking always. He was an actor. He had performed this before in other registers for other audiences. He performed it for the court with full instrument, and the court received it the way every audience he had ever played received him, with helpless appreciation. The ruling came in January 1928. Primary custody of Diana Barrymore, age 7, awarded to the father. Blanche was granted scheduled visitation, alternating Sundays, holidays by negotiation. Her daughter, who had dark hair and already at 7, some of her father's bone structure already, that jawline already, that quality of being looked at, was administered into the care of a man who would not remember her birthday without a secretary's help. Blanche's attorney came out of the courtroom and told her the terms. She sat very still. A court reporter who witnessed this later described it in a letter. She did not cry. She did not speak immediately. After what the reporter estimated as a full minute, a long time to sit in silence in a courthouse hallway, she said very quietly, "I see." She stood. She straightened her coat. It was January, a good coat. Still a good coat then. And she walked to the elevator and pressed the button and waited. And when the elevator came, she stepped in and the doors closed. And she was gone. John Barrymore was in California. He was, according to his production schedule that week, filming a scene in which he played a romantic lead. He was excellent in the scene. He was always excellent. He did not call. There is no record of a telegram. There is no record of any communication from Barrymore to Blanche on the day the ruling came down. This is consistent with the hypothesis that he experienced the custody ruling not as a crisis or even an event, but as an administrative resolution. The matter had been submitted. The matter had been decided. He had other scenes to shoot. Diana would grow up in his house and his orbit and his chaos. And eventually, at 38, she would die of an overdose in a Manhattan apartment. And her memoir, Too Much Too Soon, would describe her father as essentially absent, even when physically present, and would describe her mother as a figure seen on scheduled Sundays, increasingly strange, increasingly frightening, because Blanche, by the time Diana was old enough to form memories, was already unraveling, already the thing the lawyers had described her as, because the lawyers had been given 8 years to turn her into it. This was not punishment. This was policy. This is how the system processes women who insist on existing. To understand what Blanche Oelrichs lost, you need to understand what she was manufactured from and what it cost to be manufactured from it. She was born in 1886, some records say 1890, a discrepancy she cultivated with the practiced ease of a woman who had been taught that your own biography is a resource to be managed. Her father was Charles May Oelrichs, whose money came from shipping and railroads and the layered German-American capital accumulation that by the 1880s no longer needed to explain itself. Her mother was Blanche DeLucci Oelrichs, a woman whose primary skill was the precise social calibration of every room she entered. Who was acknowledged, who was not. Which families merited which degree of warmth, and what it cost to get these things wrong. The family's Newport cottage was called Rosecliff. The word cottage was applied to it with the specific irony that is the signature of American Gilded Age excess. Rosecliff had 40 rooms. Its floors were imported marble. Its dining room seated 30 with space for the staff to circulate, without inconveniencing the guests. It smelled of salt air coming through the ocean-facing windows and hothouse roses maintained by a full-time gardener, and the institutional cleanliness that is only achievable by a household staff of 11. Standing in any room of Rosecliff, you understood immediately that your comfort was not accidental. Everything in the house existed to communicate a single message. We are not like other people. Young Blanche was trained in this environment, the way thoroughbreds are trained with enormous expense and toward a single purpose. The purpose in the operational language of her world was an appropriate match. You learned French because you would need French in the houses you would eventually inhabit. You learned watercolor because artistic sensibility in a woman was charming when it was decorative, and did not produce anything anyone would need to take seriously. You learned which fork indicated which register of social standing, and you learned to move through rooms as though you were always being observed. Because you were always being observed, and the quality of your movement was itself a social statement. What the education at Rosecliff did not include, or was not supposed to include, the possibility that having a mind was an asset rather than a liability. The idea that wanting to be known for something you produced, a poem, a play, an argument, an idea, was not a symptom of something gone wrong in your development, but a legitimate human hunger. The concept that the life being prepared for you, the house, the husband, the charitable committees, the Newport summers, the New York winters, to the careful management of everyone else's comfort, might not be sufficient for someone of Blanche's specific intelligence and specific restlessness. Blanche learned these things anyway. She began writing poetry in her early 20s, using the name Michael Strange on the first drafts she showed anyone. She understood, with the precise instinct of someone trained to read rooms, that a male name on a manuscript would be read differently, taken more seriously, given the consideration that the same words in a woman's hand would not receive. Michael Strange was not a disguise. Michael Strange was a calculated realism about the world she was operating in. Her first marriage in 1910 to Leonard Thomas was appropriate in every dimension her family cared about. He was wealthy, socially correct, educated at the right schools, capable of making conversation at the right dinners. He and Blanche had 2 children, a son, Leonard Jr., known as Robin, born 1911, and a second child who died in infancy. The marriage was, by the accounting systems of their world, entirely successful. Blanche was 20 years old and unhappy, in ways she did not yet have language for, and she was slipping manuscript pages into the locked drawer of her writing desk and telling no one. And the drawer was getting fuller. By 1918, she had divorced Leonard Thomas, a scandal of the manageable kind, be insulated by family money and social connections into something that could be discussed as a mutual recognition of incompatibility rather than a failure of nerve or character. She had also begun performing her own verse at the literary salons that were then proliferating in New York, among a set that overlapped with, but was not identical to the Newport set. Writers, editors, artists, the peripheral celebrities of the literary world. She wore men's clothes sometimes, long before that was anything other than shocking. She cut her hair. She was quoted in the newspapers. The word that appears most consistently in coverage of her from 1918 and 1919 is striking, which in that era's journalistic coding was the word for a woman who refused to perform invisibility. She was 30 or 34, depending on which birth year, when she met John Barrymore at a dinner party in late 1919. He was the most famous actor in America and arguably in the English-speaking world. He had just completed his celebrated Richard III on Broadway, which critics had called the definitive Shakespearean performance of the generation. He was beautiful in the exhausting way of people who have always been beautiful and have learned to use it as a tool. He was also, though Blanche did not have the full inventory yet, a functioning alcoholic with a documented history of physical violence toward women, a constitutional incapacity for fidelity, and a talent which was as genuine as any of his other talents, for identifying in women the specific quality of longing that he could most efficiently exploit. He told her she was extraordinary. He told her Michael Strange was a serious literary voice, a real artist. He said he was honored to be in love with someone of her creative gifts. He wrote her letters. They still exist, housed now in a university archive, in his large theatrical hand, and in those letters, he was everything she had wanted. A man who saw her not as the sum of her social coordinates, but as a person with a mind and a voice and something to say. He meant it for approximately 14 months. After 14 months, he meant it sometimes. Then he meant it occasionally, usually after the third drink, when he was most himself and also most dangerous. Then he did not mean it at all, and what remained was the frame he had built around her identity. The fact of being John Barrymore's wife and the child they now shared, and the understanding that she had traded Rosecliff and the Newport cage for something that looked like freedom and was actually a different, more intimate kind of confinement. The golden cage at Rosecliff had been constructed from marble and salt air and the understood rules of a closed society. John Barrymore constructed his from her own hunger to be seen. He knew what she needed. Genuine recognition. The acknowledgement that Michael Strange was real and worthy, and he gave it to her at the beginning, and then he withdrew it strategically, and the withdrawal was as calculated as any of his performances. More calculated. He had been performing his entire life, but this was his masterwork. The violence started earlier almost certainly than the record shows. The first documented incident appears in a letter Blanche wrote to her friend Muriel Draper in 1921, the year Diana was born. She described an afternoon. She locates it in late October, the light already going by 4:00, when Barrymore came home from rehearsal in a state she describes as beyond the usual. He had been drinking since noon. He wanted something for dinner that she had not arranged. The specific content of the disagreement is not recorded. What is recorded is that he threw a cut-glass decanter at her across the kitchen of their West 57th Street townhouse. The decanter missed her by perhaps 8 in. It did not miss the wall. She writes that the sound it made when it shattered was exactly like something ending. Not something breaking, but something ending. A sound with finality in it. She does not describe what she did afterward. The letter moves immediately to discussing Diana's first tooth. This displacement, the violence described and then immediately stepped over as though it were an incident to be noted and filed rather than a crisis, is the behavioral signature of someone who has been trained by the violence itself and by everything before it to absorb damage without making it. The subject. Her mother had given her no language for this. Newport had given her no language for this. The culture she had been raised in had given her a complete vocabulary for managing appearances, and essentially no vocabulary for naming what happens to a woman in a room with a drunk man who has just thrown glass at her head. The violence was not constant. This is precisely how it sustains. There were weeks, sometimes months, of the man she had believed he was attentive, genuinely engaged with her work, capable of sitting across a dinner table and making the rest of the room feel peripheral. He would read her new poems and say things about them that demonstrated he had actually read them, actually thought about them, understood what she was attempting. He remembered things she told him. He could, in those stretches, make her feel more seen than anyone had ever made her feel. And then there were afternoons, like the decanter afternoon. And then there was worse than that, though she did not commit worse to letters with the same specificity. 3 separate acquaintances, a journalist, a theater colleague, a neighbor on 57th Street, later described seeing Blanche during this period with bruising they found inconsistent with the accidents attributed to it. One of these accounts is in a memoir published in 1941, written by a woman who was part of their social circle, and who names no names, but describes the situation with enough particularity that the identification is not difficult. Her social world did not intervene, and this needs to be stated directly. The people around Blanche Oelrichs in the early years of her marriage to John Barrymore, wealthy people, educated people, people who had the resources and the standing to say something, did not say something. The conventions of the class were clear on this. What happens in a marriage is the private business of the marriage. To acknowledge evidence of violence is to force a conversation that will make everyone at dinner uncomfortable. He was also John Barrymore, which meant the conventions protecting him from accountability were amplified by cultural reverence. You did not say to America's greatest actor that you had seen his wife's bruises. The crack, when it came, arrived from the direction of her work. By 1922, Blount had written a full-length play titled Claire de Lune. She had worked on it for 2 years. It was a serious attempt. Ambitious in structure, complex in language, drawing on the symbolist influences she had been absorbing for a decade, she persuaded Barrymore to star in the production. A decision he agreed to with what she later described as theatrical generosity. That cost him nothing, because he assumed it would fail. And failing gracefully is a thing he understood. The production opened in New York in April 1921 and ran for 64 performances. Not a hit, not a disaster. A serious production that received mixed reviews and the ambiguous cultural status of work that is too idiosyncratic for easy praise. The reviews. This is where the crack runs all the way through. The New York Times review ran under a headline that read, John Barrymore in a new play. Not new play by Michael Strange. Not Blanche Oelrichs' Claire de Lune. John Barrymore in a new play. The text of the review devoted 4 paragraphs to Barrymore's performance. Compelling, luminous, the actor at the height of his considerable powers, and 2 sentences to the play itself attributed to his wife writing as Michael Strange. His wife writing as Michael Strange. The possessive, his wife. She read this at the kitchen table at 7 in the morning, still in her dressing gown, the paper flat on the table in front of her. The coffee was going cold beside her hand. She read the review once, then she read it again. Then she sat for a long time without moving. Then she stood and went to the window. The street below was already moving. February in New York, the delivery wagons making their rounds. A man in a gray coat walking fast with his collar up, a woman with a child by the hand. Ordinary people doing the ordinary work of a morning. The horse on the nearest wagon breathed steam into the cold air, and the driver moved with the efficiency of someone who knows exactly what the day requires of him, no more and no less. She stayed at the window for a long time. When she finally moved, it was to get more coffee. She had understood it before intellectually. She had understood that being John Barrymore's wife was consuming the oxygen around her own identity. But understanding something intellectually and feeling it in your body at a kitchen table on a February morning, be reading a review of your own play that frames you as a possessive case of your husband's name. These are different things. The body knowledge is different. It is harder to rationalize away. She decided at that window to leave. She did not leave immediately. She was pregnant with Diana. Diana would be born in March 1921, 1 month after this review. And the timing made immediate departure impossible, and the pregnancy made the decision feel in the irrational architecture of grief, like a betrayal. She would have another few years. She would try once more to exist inside the marriage without being consumed by it. She would try and fail and try again. She filed for divorce in 1925, 4 years after the kitchen window. It took her 4 years to walk from the window to the lawyer's office. This is not weakness. This is the geometry of a world that has been constructed to make that walk as long as possible and as costly as you can be made to pay. The divorce filing landed in 1925, and Barrymore's legal team began assembling its response within the week. This pace, the immediate mobilization of serious legal resources, tells you something important. He had anticipated this, perhaps not the specific date of filing, but the eventuality. A man with his money and his lawyers does not respond to a divorce filing in 1 week unless he has already been thinking about how he would respond to a divorce filing. The counter-strategy had been prepared in advance. Blanche had been watched. The financial warfare came first. The marriage had been financially entangled in the particular way of a couple, where one party earns enormous amounts of money, and the other party spends in the style to which she was born, and the spending style and the earning rate had never been formally reconciled. Barrymore's attorneys introduced evidence of what they characterized as Blanche's financial recklessness, the theatrical investments she had made in her own productions, the household costs of the West 57th Street townhouse, the staff she maintained, the travel, the entertaining, all of it accurate, all of it framed as pathology rather than as the entirely unremarkable expenditure pattern of a wealthy woman from a wealthy family. He had also, in the years leading up to the filing, had begun structuring his own finances in ways that minimized the community property available for division. His film contracts. He was under contract to Warner Brothers from 1924 at a salary that would reach $76,500 per picture by 1926, was structured through a corporate entity that his attorneys had established for exactly this purpose. This was not unusual. This was planning. Barrymore was not a sophisticated man in many respects, but he had sophisticated people around him, and those people had been managing his financial exposure since before Blanche filed. The settlement she received, finalized in the divorce proceedings, not yet the custody hearing, was considerably less than she had anticipated, and considerably less than an accurate accounting of the marriage's shared assets would have produced. She accepted it. Her own attorneys told her, according to a letter she wrote to a friend in late 1927, that fighting further would cost more in legal fees than it would recover in settlement funds, and that the judge had limited sympathy for wealthy women disputing the size of their divorce settlements. The social erasure moved on a separate track, and was in some ways more total. New York society, the specific altitude of it that Blanche had inhabited, the intersection of old money and artistic celebrity that was her natural element, did not formally expel her. Nothing so declarative. What happened was a series of small recalibrations, each individually deniable, collectively devastating. Invitations arrived less frequently and from lower registers. The hostesses who had competed to have her at their tables began to develop scheduling conflicts. Dinner parties to which Barrymore was invited, she was not. And since the divorce proceedings were ongoing through most of 1926 and 1927, during which they were technically still married, the message was not ambiguous. She had disturbed the order of things. She had refused the role. She would not be accommodated. Her family's response was the specific cruelty of people who love someone and cannot afford to say so. Her mother, Blanche Oelrichs, wrote to her daughter in the spring of 1926. The letter is in the Columbia University archive. It is 2 full pages in her mother's careful hand, and it does not mention the violence. It does not mention the broken glass, the bruises, the sanitarium stays, the 6 years of systematic diminishment. It expresses with the precision of someone trained since birth to express things precisely without saying them. The family's hope that Blanche will conduct herself with what her mother terms appropriate discretion throughout this difficulty. This difficulty. 3 years of documented physical abuse, a custody fight over a 7-year-old, the methodical dismantling of everything Blanche had built of her own identity, the difficulty. The archive has no reply from Blanche, whether she wrote back and the reply was lost, or whether she read her mother's letter and decided there was nothing to say cannot be determined. Both possibilities feel accurate. The literary world, which had been Blanche's refuge, the arena in which she was most fully herself, was not immune. The theatrical and publishing circles of late 1920s New York had developed a working understanding of Michael Strange that was not entirely disconnected from the opinion of John Barrymore's ex-wife. Eccentric, difficult, a strong personality with strong opinions, not quite commercial, not quite manageable. These are the words used by professionals to describe women who insist on the quality of their own work and refuse to be grateful for lesser opportunities. The production she proposed in 1926 and 1927 did not find producers. The poems she submitted did not find enthusiastic homes. The invitations to perform and lecture came less frequently. She was still writing. The discipline was the last structuring force. She published a second volume of verse in 1928, the same year the custody ruling came down, titled Resurrecting Life, which had in fact been the title of her first major collection, reissued in a revised edition with new poems added. The reviews it received were brief and lukewarm, and several of them mentioned, seemingly unable to help themselves, that she was the former wife of John Barrymore. In a letter to Edna St. Vincent Millay, the poet, a genuine friend, a woman navigating similar terrain with different resources, Blanche described what this period felt like from inside. The letter is dated November 1927. She writes that she sometimes stands in the centers of rooms and cannot remember why she entered them. She writes, not a metaphor. Literally standing in a room, coat still on, no memory of purpose. She calls it the sensation of being rubbed out from the inside. She writes that she is afraid. And then she crosses out afraid and writes something else. The next word is illegible. The ink gone too thick where she pressed through the first word. Then the sentence continues. But I am still here. They have not quite finished. The rubbing out from the inside. This is the mechanism of prolonged violence followed by prolonged legal assault followed by prolonged social silence. It does not announce itself. It accumulates. It presents as fatigue, as ordinary forgetting, as the understandable consequence of a hard several years. And by the time you understand it as what it is, the systematic psychological attrition of a person by a combination of forces that have individually deniable intentions and collectively a single effect, you are already substantially erased. You are the hole where someone was. In January 1928, the court gave Barrymore custody of Diana. He was in California when the ruling came down. He had other scenes to shoot. He was always excellent in the scenes. By 1929, Blanche Oelrichs was living in a rented apartment in the West 7s in Manhattan. Not the West 57th Street townhouse. That was gone, absorbed back into the financial machinery of the divorce. Not Newport. Newport was not a possibility financially or psychologically. And in any case, Newport was a place for the families that had not chosen her. The apartment was in a pre-war building that smelled of the accumulated cooking of its previous tenants, and the specific institutional damp of pipes that had been carrying water since 1910. The ceilings were high, but the rooms were smaller than she was accustomed to, and the arrangement of the furniture brought from the 57th Street house, too large for this space, pressing against the walls with the defeated insistence of objects that belong somewhere else, communicated with each. Entry into a room that this was not where she was supposed to be. She had one maid, a woman who came 3 mornings a week. On the other days, she cleaned herself badly. She had never been taught to clean, which was not a personal failing but a class curriculum that simply hadn't included this module. And she cooked also badly, burning rice, miscalculating the timing of things, standing at the stove in the late afternoon with the posture of someone performing an activity that feels faintly absurd, as though she is an actor cast against type in a role requiring skills the casting director incorrectly assumed she had. The money was deteriorating. The divorce settlement had seemed manageable in 1927 and was revealing itself in 1929 to be insufficient in ways the original calculation had not accounted for. The ongoing cost of legal consultations related to visitation disputes, the cost of maintaining even this reduced version of social presence, the cost of continuing to work as a writer, submissions, communications, the professional maintenance of an identity that the market was showing decreasing interest in supporting. She sold jewelry. This happened in stages, each stage representing a concession she had previously identified as a line she would not cross. The strand of pearls her mother had given her at her debut, sold in 1929 at a jeweler on 47th Street, that conducted these transactions with the practiced discretion required by a clientele whose dignity depended on pretending the transaction wasn't happening. A diamond bracelet from the first marriage from Leonard Thomas to a gift that had survived 2 divorces and now went to a glass case on 47th Street for a number that was less than she had expected and more than she had feared. A ring she owed her publisher money, an advance for a book of poems that she was writing but could not finish. The conditions required for finishing were not present. The concentration kept fragmenting. She would sit at the desk and produce 2 good lines, and then sit for an hour and produce nothing, and then give up and walk around the apartment, and come back and produce another line, and then stop again. She wrote to her editor that the book would be ready by spring. It was not ready by spring. Robin, her son from the first marriage, was 19 in 1929 and finishing his education. He came to see her when he could, which was not often. And when he came, the visits had the careful quality of someone trying very hard not to let their worry show, which communicated the worry more completely than directness would have. He was her son, and she loved him, and she was frightening him, and she knew she was frightening him, and she could not stop. She was running out of the performance energy required to appear to him like a woman who was managing. Diana she saw on the scheduled Sundays, every other Sunday, the agreement said, and every other Christmas and alternating Easter and 2 weeks in the summer. She prepared for these visits with a focus that had become the organizing architecture of her weeks. She bought things, small things, a book Robin had liked at Diana's age, a box of chocolates from the shop on Madison Avenue, a paper of colored pencils that she could not straightforwardly afford. She tidied the apartment with a thoroughness she did not apply to any other occasion, moving the manuscript papers off the table and into a drawer, washing the dishes that had accumulated on the counter, arranging flowers, cheap carnations from the corner vendor, not the florist, in a vase on the windowsill. Diana arrived and was polite. She was 8, then 9, then 10, and each year the politeness was more practiced and more distant. And Blanche, who had raised children, who understood the difference between a child's natural formality with a less-known parent, and the particular performed distance of a child who has been coached, felt the coaching in every visit. Not malicious coaching, perhaps just the ambient messaging of a household in which the mother was a figure of complication rather than comfort. Barrymore's third wife, Dolores Costello, had given Diana a functional home, which Blanche could acknowledge as a fact, and which cost her something every time she acknowledged it. When Diana left on Sunday evenings, Blanche would sit in the tidy apartment for a long time, not reading, not writing. The carnations in the vase, the cleared table, the managed surfaces, the whole performance of capability assembled for a 5-hour visit, and then in the silence of Diana's departure, subsiding, the apartment reasserting its actual quality. The damp, the ill-fitting furniture, the smell of something burned on the stove 2 days ago that she hadn't quite cleaned. In October 1929, the stock market collapsed. She had almost nothing left to lose in the markets, which meant the crash affected her differently than it affected the people she had grown up among, who were losing actual fortunes. For a year or two, the particular shame of declining was distributed more broadly. Old money in reduced circumstances was everywhere in 1930. The consolation was thin, and she recognized it as thin, but she noticed it, and noting it was something. Barrymore was in California earning $1 million and spending most of it, and marrying Dolores Costello, and having another child, and being John Barrymore. The world organized itself around him. He required that. The world complied. By 1935, the body had begun to register the preceding decade in the way bodies do, not all at once, but in accumulation, of each small withdrawal of vitality, leaving the total slightly less. She had lost weight in a way that was not the fashionable slenderness of her social world, but the gauntness of someone whose relationship to eating had become unreliable. Meals skipped not from vanity but from forgetting from the low-grade despair that reduces appetite to something you have to remind yourself to experience her face, which had been described in 1919 journalism as striking and arresting, had sharpened past those words into something that acquaintances who saw her in these years recorded in letters as haunted and terribly changed. Her hair had gone gray early and was maintained without the attention it had once received, brushed, pinned, but not arranged with any care for effect. She had stopped caring about effect in certain specific ways, which is itself an effect, the effect of someone who has given up performing a version of herself for an audience that has stopped watching. She was drinking. Not catastrophically, not in the way of Barrymore's furniture throwing afternoons, but with the quiet regularity of someone who has discovered that 2 glasses of rye whiskey reliably shortens the long evenings and blurs the sharper edges of what an evening alone in a rented apartment contains. A glass before dinner, one with, one after. The bottle on the kitchen shelf replenished on a schedule she would not have named as a schedule if you asked her. She would have said she kept a bottle of rye in the kitchen the way one keeps a bottle of rye in the kitchen. That is what it looked like from outside. From inside, it was the precise management of a pain that had no other available management. She was still writing. The poems came harder now in smaller increments, requiring longer stretches of effort for shorter results. But they came. She sent things to magazines. Some were accepted. She performed occasional readings for small audiences in small venues, not the rooms she had performed in at the height of her reputation, but rooms. She had not stopped being Michael Strange. She could not afford to stop. Michael Strange was the last version of herself that was fully inhabited. In November 1936, she received a letter from Diana's school in Connecticut. Diana was 15. She had told a school friend that she did not want to continue the Sunday visits to her mother's apartment. The friend had told a dormitory supervisor. The supervisor had written to the custodial parent. Barrymore's attorney had written to Blanche's attorney. The letter Blanche received was formally worded, carefully neutral in its language, and stated that given Diana's expressed reluctance, the visitation schedule would be modified to once per month at most, pending further assessment. She read this letter at her kitchen table at 8:00 in the morning. She read it through twice. She set it precisely flat on the table. She stood up. She went to the window. It was November. The street below was gray and cold, and had the specific quality of a late autumn morning in New York that contains no illusions about what the season has become. A woman across the street was struggling with an umbrella that the wind had turned inside out. A taxi was standing at the corner, waiting for something. A man in a long, dark coat walked past without looking up. Blanche stood at the window for a long time. Her daughter did not want to see her. This was the sentence she could not get past. Whatever the letter's diplomatic framing, expressed reluctance, pending further assessment subject to review, this was the sentence at its center. 15-year-old Diana Barrymore did not want to visit her mother. So whether this was Diana's genuine feeling or the feeling Diana had been helped to construct by 10 years of living in a household that had consistently presented her mother as the difficult variable in the family equation, this distinction was not available to Blanche at the kitchen window. It was only the sentence. She did not leave the apartment for 11 days. She did not answer the telephone. She did not write, which was a signal in itself. The writing stopped before anything else stopped. A robin came on the 4th day, and she let him in and spoke to him in monosyllables for an hour, and then asked him politely to go home. He went because there was nothing else to do, because the door was closing whether he left or not. He called the next day. She did not answer. On the 12th day, she got up. She bathed. She dressed with some care, not for anyone outside, but for the discipline of it, the ritual assertion of selfhood that getting dressed has always involved. She went to her desk and wrote for several hours. What she wrote is not in the archive. It may have been the letter she finally sent to Diana, which also does not survive. It may have been poems that she later destroyed. It may have been something she wrote only for herself, for the act of writing it. Because writing was the only form of self-evidence she still completely trusted. Then she put on her coat and went out and walked for 2 hours in the November cold, without any particular destination, just walking, her breath making small clouds in the gray air, her shoes on the pavement steady and purposeful. She had decided with the same cold clarity she had felt at the 57th Street window in 1922, watching the horse breathe steam in the February morning. The same clarity that had taken her 4 years to act on, but had been real from the moment it arrived. That she would not give him the satisfaction of complete obliteration. She would work. She would remain. Michael Strange would continue to exist, diminished and underfunded and largely unread in a rented apartment in the 70s, but would continue. Survival as the final form of defiance available to her, the only one he had not yet found a way to litigate. Blanche Oelrichs dies on October 5, 1950. She is in a suite at the Ambassador Hotel in New York City. She is 64 years old by official records. She is alone. The cause is listed as heart failure. Hotel staff find her in the morning. She is dressed. The lamp on the bedside table is on. There are manuscript pages on the writing desk near the window. She was working apparently close to the end, because she always worked, because the work was the last version of herself that remained fully intact. And it was still there when everything else was going. Diana is not there. Diana is in Hollywood attempting an acting career under her father's name. Diana Barrymore, his name. The only currency she inherited with any market value. She and Blanche have not spoken in more than a year. The arrangement hardened gradually from coolness to silence. The way these things harden, no dramatic break. Just less and then nothing. John Barrymore died 8 years earlier in May 1942 of kidney and liver failure, the terminal accounting of a body that processed approximately 40 years of serious alcoholism. He was 60 years old. He died in a Los Angeles hospital surrounded by people, colleagues, hangers on the specific machinery of celebrity death that ensures the famous are not alone, even when they are dying because of choices that isolated them from genuine connection. The obituaries ran for columns in every major paper. The great profile, the greatest Hamlet of his generation, brilliant, difficult, extraordinary. They used the word tragic for his decline, which is the word the culture keeps in reserve for brilliant men who destroy themselves while destroying others. He is tragedy. She is just gone. The New York Times runs 3 sentences on Blanche Oelrichs, poet and dramatist, known for her pen name Michael Strange, former wife of the actor John Barrymore, former wife. Even in the death notice, the construction of her identity as a possessive case of his, even dead, she is his former wife before she is her own poet. 7 years after Blanche's death in 1957, Diana Barrymore publishes a memoir titled Too Much Too Soon. It is a brave, messy, wounded book, written by a woman who spent her entire life trying to understand what had been done to her and by whom. She describes her father with the complicated ferocity of someone raised to worship an absence. She describes her mother with something harder to name, a mixture of love and fear, and the permanent injury of having been, as a child, placed between 2 people who were at war and told implicitly to choose. Diana died in 1960. She was 38 years old. She was found in her New York apartment. The cause was an overdose of sedatives and alcohol. She had been estranged from most of the people who had mattered to her. She had never fully recovered from a childhood spent as the prize in a custody dispute, as the leverage point in her father's campaign against her mother, as the collateral in a war between a man with all the weapons and a woman with none that the system recognized. John Barrymore destroyed both of them. He destroyed Blanche directly with his fists, with his lawyers, hugged, with the systematic appropriation of her literary credit, with the removal of her daughter. He destroyed Diana at a remove through the downstream consequences of winning a custody battle he had no business winning, and then raising a child in the ambient chaos of his self-destruction, while her mother disintegrated in a rented apartment across town. The system helped the legal system that in 1928 granted custody to a documented drunk with a history of violence over a poet with a history of writing. The social world that responded to Blanche's distress with scheduling conflicts and dinner party emissions. The literary establishment that reviewed her work through the frame of her marriage and her divorce. The family that asked her for appropriate discretion when what she needed was a lawyer and a lock. These are not abstractions. These are institutions operating as designed. The design has not fundamentally changed. What remains of Blanche Oelrichs, a small archive at Columbia University, 2 collections of poetry almost entirely out of print, some letters, a handful of references in Barrymore biographies in which she appears as a complication in his story. The thin record that remains when a society has decided, efficiently and without announcement, that a woman was not worth the trouble of remembering what she wrote in the poems and the letters. And the dramatic pieces, the through line, the thing she was reaching toward in everything was the right to be seen as a person. Not an accessory, not a cautionary tale, not a difficult woman or an unstable mother, or a former wife. A person with a mind and a voice, and something to say and the right to say it. John Barrymore spent 6 years making certain that right was not exercised. He had the law and the money and the cultural reverence that is extended to brilliant, difficult men and withheld from brilliant, difficult women. And he used all of it, and it worked. He is remembered as the great profile. She is a footnote in his biography. This is not an accident. This is a system, and the first thing the system requires is your silence about.